Hey everyone, we are going to be telling you about the Brown versus Board of Education case, so let's get started. The first notable case was in 1849 when Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled against Roberts versus City of Boston, declaring that segregated schools were permissible under the state's constitution. This mid-1800s novelty would have turned no heads during its time, as the Civil War and 13th Amendment would not have taken place for another decade. This case's importance, however, lies in its direct connection to the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case. In conjunction, both of these declared, after the freeing of slaves and establishment of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, that a separate but equal doctrine was constitutional under the law in both private and public places. These all led to the establishment of multiple cases through 1908 and the 1950s for attempts at desegregation and segregation. These were made by both African American and other marginalized groups alike to help integrate their schools. In 1952, the first oral arguments were heard for Brown versus Board of Education, and Noelle is going to give a little bit more information about that.
David versus Board of Education of Prince Edward County, Bowling versus Sharp, and Gebert versus Ethel. All these cases were filed to challenge one main issue, the constitutionality of the state-sponsored segregation in public schools. And so, in 1951, Oliver Brown filed a suit against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, when his daughter Linda Brown was rejected admission to Topeka's all-white elementary public schools. He brought to the Supreme Court's attention that the 14th Amendment was being flat-out violated through the act of segregating schools. Thurgood Marshall served as their chief attorney, as he was a graduate of Howard Law School and the head of the NAACP Legal Defense. He was fully equipped for this task. Marshall would eventually become the first Black Supreme Court justice when President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed him in 1967. His main point was that separate school systems for blacks and whites were inherently unequal, and thus violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which states that no state can deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Chief Justice Earl Warren was appointed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower to be the new Chief Justice since the previous Chief Justice, Fred Vinson, passed away before the hearing of Brown versus Board of Education. Warren would be the one to issue the verdict of this case in the end, which you will hear about next.
Now moving on to the outcome and response. The Supreme Court initially heard the case in 1952, but did not come to a conclusion. On May 14th of 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Brown and against the notion of separate but equal. The vote was unanimous, 9-0. The court found segregation unconstitutional and that it violated equal protection granted to the United States citizens by the 14th Amendment. They believed that schooling is necessary to become a good student and citizen, and segregation can affect the student's ability to learn because they feel inferior. Some school districts desegregated peacefully, while some required the National Guard's assistance to control violent protests. Due to the expected backlash, school desegregation did not begin right away. Instead, those permitting segregation of schools were required to submit plans for integration. On May 31, 1955, the court handed down another decision in Brown v. Board of Education 2. This second case held local schools responsible for implementing desegregation by using court oversight and directed the districts to proceed with speed.
The Brown versus Board of Education case is still so significant to us today, and here's why it made such an impact. It was the first thing that shook the foundations of American culture well beyond the obvious walls of the public schools they were fighting for. Brown versus Board of Education offered hope that America was prepared to deliver on the promises of the Constitution. After an entire history of attempting to prevent the education of black citizens and keep them in skills like agriculture and trade to serve the white economy, things had finally changed. This sparked hope that African American individuals can challenge their rights and win. Here are the tangible things that had Brown versus Board of Education not happened, we might not see today. Brown entitled students to receive a quality education regardless of their racial status. This also allowed for African American teachers to teach in any public school they chose, a liberty they did not have before. This began America's transformation into the truly multiracial nation that we are seeing today. It grew the black middle class, and other things like healthcare accessibility have significantly changed due to their ability to receive equal education. Before Brown, only about 1 in every 7 African Americans, compared to 1 in every 3 whites, held a high school degree. Today, 85% of African American adults hold a high school degree, nearly equaling the 89% of whites who have one. Before Brown, only about 1 in every 40 African Americans earned a college degree, and now more than 1 in 5 hold that same degree. So while it can be seen that things are still not perfect or equal, Brown is important to us today because it was the first thing that spark-plugged progress and revealed the opportunity of mutual efforts to work towards equality. And this is something that forever changed the education system that we know and see today.
As we just heard, that this case has been such an impactful one throughout history and in through today, we're going to be able to look at how it has a course connection to all the different books we've been reading. So in blue on this timeline, you can see multiple different monumental events that have happened while coinciding with all of the different timelines of the books we've read. And these times for the books are the timelines in which the authors set them, not necessarily when the authors wrote them. And the most prevalent thing that I've found while reading the books to find a connection to this specific case is the overwhelming sense of the fight for civil rights against the criminal justice system. And this fight for civil rights is one that we are still fighting today, and one that Martin Luther King did not just start in the 1960s, but he definitely propelled into the future in sparking things such as civil disobedience and nonviolent action. But in this latest book that we read in Gaines in the 1970s, we're able to see that there still is harsh racial injustice still going on, despite facts like Rosa Parks standing up for herself and Brown versus Board of Education setting a standard for non-segregated schools, yet 20 years later we still have racial injustice. So that's the main point, and the main takeaway I've gotten is this case being a main centerpiece, as you can see in the timeline, even though it did have quote-unquote a large impact in that it deemed segregated schools as unconstitutional. That effect was not put in place until multiple years later, and desegregation was still a prolonged process for multiple years. So I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation, and on the next slide you can see some resource links that are available. Hopefully we can get this PowerPoint shared with you so you can see all the resources to find more about Brown versus Board of Education, and I hope you guys all enjoyed this presentation.